Let me say hello this morning where I am to the World Parliament of Religions. And in this time that I have, let me honor the Dalai Lama who just spoke. You know, in a real sense, I believe that we are in the midst of a moral crisis, a moral love and justice crisis across the world. And I look at that through the lenses of the realities, the continuing realities of systemic racism. And by that, I'm not talking about interpersonal racism, but things like voter suppressions, which are not only political, but theological suppression, because when we don't allow people to vote, we're suggesting that they're not human because we only give the right to vote to humans. We're suggesting that somehow they are non human or less than human. I'm talking about all of the disparities in terms of how we treat Native brothers and sisters and indigenous communities and in healthcare and the resegregation of public schools and how we treat immigrants, especially in our country, xenophobia, unjust incarceration. But we also have a problem with systemic poverty. In the country I live in, over 140 million people right now are poor and low wealth. 8 million more fell into poverty during COVID. A quarter million people die every year from poverty before COVID. 700 people die every day. But around the world, over a billion people live in extreme poverty, while less than 1/10 of 1% of people in the world have more money than they will ever spend. Over 50% of the world struggles every day just for basic subsistence. And in our country, it just came out this morning that while 22 million people lost their jobs during COVID, and poor and low wealth workers were the first to go to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick from COVID, the first to die. Billionaires have made over $2 trillion in COVID while we are arguing in this country over just providing $350 billion a year for 10 years to help people recover who've been beaten down worse than they were before COVID. We also have, as a moral crisis in this world, ecological devastation, the denial of health care. In my country alone, 87 million people get up every morning without health care or either are uninsured. 4 million families wake up every morning, can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. We also have the underfunding of public education and the resegregation of our schools, which fundamentally hurts our humanity. And in this country I live in, we have the war economy and militarism, the fact that 54 cents of every discretionary dollar America spends, we spend it on the war economy and less than 15 cents on things like healthcare and living wages and education. And then we have this moral crisis of religious nationalism and white nationalism that's spreading everywhere. It's never really not been existence, but even more is coming back to the fore throughout the world, which becomes the breeding ground for authoritarian leadership that pronounces and suggests that that leadership is actually the will of God. And COVID has exposed the fissures that exist because of all of these interlocking injustices. So we have a moral crisis, a love crisis, a justice crisis, and we believe in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival with my dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, and all people who are joined in this country. And recently we were at the Vatican and shared with world leaders, religious leaders about it there, that we must have a moral fusion movement where people impacted by these various moral crises come together with religious leaders and advocates to stand in a nonviolent way, but to stand in truth and love and justice, and to call for the kind of peace which my Jewish brothers and sisters call shalom, which is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice and the presence of peace. One of the reasons, one of the things we believe has to happen is we need a generationally transformative, major Poor People's Assembly and Moral and Low-Wage Workers Moral Assembly and National Moral March on Washington, D.C., and we hope other world capitals around the world to amass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly. We're calling for it June 18th, 2022. 3 days before the summer solstice, when the light is closest to the earth. We need to shine a light. We need not a day, not just a gathering, but a declaration that we won't be silent anymore on these matters. And it needs to be led by voices and faces of the poor and low wealth people, those who are most impacted by these interlocking injustices. And it needs to be religious and moral leaders of every faith and advocates there. Why? To shift the narrative and to build power, to begin talking about we must change this world from the bottom up. I was recently talking to the special rapporteur of the extreme poverty at the UN, and he clearly said, we do not have a scarcity of resources, nor do we have a scarcity of ideas to address the interlocking injustices. What we have is a scarcity of moral consciousness, and we must have a gathering, a day, a declaration, if you will, a time of coming together that commences a continuous unified movement to eradicate poverty and low wealth from the bottom up. Moral fusion politics. That's what the abolitionists were when they stood up against slavery. That's what the civil rights movement was when it stood up against the evils of Jim Crow. That's what happened in South Africa when they came together. Moral fusion organizing, bringing people together around various traditions, around an agenda from many different places of every race, creed, color, and sexuality. And we have some basic theological commitments that we look to in the Poor People's Campaign that I would share with you now. One of them is from the prophet Isaiah that is honored by Jews and Muslims and Christians. In that prophetic book, in chapter 10, it says, "Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the people and make women and children pray. Where will that nation stand in the day of reckoning? What will happen to its riches?" There is this theological suggestion that if the nation abuses the poor and robs the rights of the poor and worries more about the rights of the landowner or the rights of the wealthy and robs the rights of the people, something happens. Politicians become animalistic and the people become like prey, and ultimately that hurts the entire nation. Isaiah 55, one of our that's honored by Jews, Muslims, Christians, and many religions, says that we must cry loud. We must be like a trumpet and sound the cry against injustice. That's what love and truth must do. And we must call for a loosing of the bands of wickedness. And in Hebrew, that literally means to pay people what they deserve. And it says we must welcome the poor. We must bring in those who are hurting. We must have an agenda of repairing. And if we don't, then the nation actually sets up its own destruction. But if we do, then in fact, the nation will be called a repairer of the breach. And the light of God will shine on the nation, and the peace of God will be in the nation, and the love of God will be upon the nation. And so as religious leaders, not as political leaders, we have to warn the nations. We have to say to them that justice is what love looks like in public. And we have to hear the ancient prophets. In fact, we must be like the ancient prophets and not merely be tied in a sanctuary or a temple, but we must be engaged in the public square. We must be engaged in the public square. We must, as religious leaders today and in our religions, condemn hate and condemn injustice and condemn those things that make for confusion and not peace. And not only in the personal realm, but our theological convictions say that we must do it in the public square. Too often, Ezekiel 22, another text honored by so many, says that the religious community has endorsed predatory activity because it didn't speak out. It stayed silent. It didn't stand in the gap, Ezekiel said. And God had to go to the valleys of dry bones among the people to find the prophetic witness that should have been coming from the religious cultus. So we must have a moral movement in this world. It must be a united moral movement to address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of health care, the underfunding of public education, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. I'm a Christian, and I happen to follow the teachings of Jesus and the leadership of Jesus and the leadership of the Holy Spirit. And Jesus clearly said in his first sermon publicly to the whole world, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor." And the word poor there is the Greek word translated that means is patokos. It means those who've been made poor by exploitive systems. So Jesus was saying that there is no evangel, no good news that is not actively addressing what's happening to the poor and the brokenhearted and the least of these and those that are left out. In fact, the first day that Jesus simply announced that he had come in the Spirit to preach good news to the poor, the text says that they tried to kill him that day because he was talking about love toward the poor, not just a love between brother and sister or husband and wife, but he was literally questioning the empire, questioning Rome, questioning Caesar's mentality that claimed that Caesar was God and money was God and ownership was God. Jesus was saying, no, if it's not good news to the poor, if faith and religious traditions and practices do not preach good news to the poor and do not ultimately challenge injustice, then that spirituality must be rendered suspect in terms of authentic faith, as Jesus talked about. And then finally, in our tradition, there's a great text in Amos. We often have heard it said when Dr. King used to say, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. But if you go back a few verses in that ancient text, it talks about a time coming when injustice is rampant and mean leaders are rampant and lying is rampant and people are about to give up. And then God says to the prophet, if I can find a remnant, I don't need everybody, but if I can find a remnant of people who will go in the streets and cry out in the marketplace and shut down the factories non-violently, he says, if I can find the people who will grieve over the realities of injustice and will grieve publicly, not privately, who will grieve in the streets, then he says, I will give you divine assistance. I will help the people. And then justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty spring. I believe that God is waiting on us in the religious community to wail, to grieve, to cry in the public square with those who cry every day from these interlocking injustices. And in that process, the Spirit will give us divine assistance to transform the world through love and truth and nonviolence and peace. You know, Jürgen Moltmann, the German theologian, said that faith, wherever it develops into hope, causes not rest, but unrest, not patience, but impatience. That faith, wherever it becomes hope, does not calm the unquiet heart, but is itself this unquiet heart in man, in humanity. Those who hope in God, can no longer put up with reality as it is, but began to suffer under it with love and truth and justice in order to contradict the reality. And we must be clear, we need this moral contradiction. When the Spirit of God fell on Pentecost, the Bible says that one of the things that happened when the Spirit came is that they formed a community that was the contradiction of Caesar's community of neglect and harm. And they formed a community in the Spirit that showed it was possible to live in a way where nobody had need. And then finally, Jesus said again, every nation will be judged not by how many worship services she has, not by how many times she prays in her Senate or in her Congress or in her parliament, but when people were hungry, did the nation, not individual benevolence, but did the nation establish justice? Did the nation feed them? Did the nation give them water? Did the nation release the prisoners? Did the nation heal the sick? Did the nation welcome the immigrant and the stranger? This is our calling now. We cannot be silent anymore. Too many people are hurting our people, and we cannot be silent. Silence would be betrayal of our spirituality. We must have a moral revival in the world and in this country. We must have a third reconstruction. We must have a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on the capital of these countries, not as a day, but as a declaration, as a commencing from that day forward, we will be united. There is no time to waste. Democracy versus autocracy is the battle of our time. We have to escalate the nonviolent moral struggle of our moment. It's time to make ending poverty a priority, and it's possible. It's time to expand democratic participation across the world and in the United States and stop the suppression. It's possible. It's time to protect free speech and ability to organize. It's time to ensure that we have policies that change the condition of the 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country and the billions around the world. It's time to be a world where anybody who works makes a living wage. It's time to enact fair taxes on corporations and the wealthy. It's past time to make sure that there is what the UN Declaration said in 1948 becomes a reality, and that is that housing is a human right, that water is a human right, that basic income is a human right, that education is a human right. It's time for us. We've put too much money in war. In my country alone, $21 trillion in war and militarization since 9/11. Since $21 trillion. $1 trillion of that or less than that could deal with the issues of poverty and hurt and injustice in these areas in our world. It's time, it's past time. There is a Kairos moment. The Spirit is calling us. We must cut these military budgets. In America alone, if we cut our military budget in half and put it toward the things that lift communities, we would still have more money in military spending than North Korea, China, Russia, all combined together. And to put more money in death than we do in life is a moral spiral downward. It's time. It's time, and we must have a coming together of poor and low wealth impacted people of all religions and faiths and creeds and colors and sexualities. And we must have religious leaders of all faith. As the Dalai Lama said, at the essence of all of our faiths is this idea of love and compassion and peace and justice. And we must have advocates, and we must have a worldwide poor people's movement, a poor people's assembly, and low-wage workers assembly, and moral gatherings all over in capitals throughout the world. We're going to begin it on June 18th, 2022. Hope you will join with us, because the time is now. And if we wail properly, if we cry properly, if we stand properly, if we unite properly, there is this ancient promise that God has shown He answers. She has shown she answers time and time again. I will be with you. I will give you power. I will help you make it so. Justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. God bless you, and let us forever stand together in our moral commitments to love, to truth, to justice, and to nonviolence.